of India and broadly speaking, South Asia and beyond. So when I started, Shruti, when I started reading your book, Violent Fraternity, I was just, I just read the first couple of pages, and immediately I was reminded of a book that I got to know that you also mentioned in this book, also in the acknowledgement section that appears at the end of the book. The book that occurred to me was Chris Bailey's book, Recovering Liberties. And I was reminded of that book because of the paradigm that you have chosen in your own book, which is to not just think of the Western political thoughts and how they travel to different parts of the global South, or particularly to India, and then get mediated through the political actions and articulations of Indian political thinkers and actors. Um, Bailey did the opposite in some sense, um, by thinking of how those ideas are not just getting mediated through the actions and choices and thoughts of the Indian thinkers like Ambedkar, Nehru, and so on, but also they are going back to the so-called Western metropolitan center and influencing their own equations in Europe, back in Europe, right? So uh, in some sense, you do something similar in this book, because the focus is not just on how these thinkers have been struggling with, have been, cogitating about these important registers of our political being: fraternity, liberty, equality, sovereignty, and so on. But how these thoughts have their own, South Asian, Indian, unique dimensions, so to speak. Not a nativist kind of thing, but some unique equations that have emerged. And you argue in this book, to some extent, that those thoughts can actually have uh, very important underpinnings for the rest of the world, which is why I believe you are also talking about the Indian age, roughly put. So I would love to hear you speak about that, and also for the audience. This is a book that not only focuses on the important political thinkers of early 20th century, starting with Tilak and Gandhi and Ambedkar and Iqbal and the Gadar Party, Hardayal, slightly Bhagat Singh, Savarkar. But it's also a book that focuses, very interestingly for me, it focuses on psychoanalytical approaches to some extent, not in a very, very exhaustive fashion, but in a very innovative way, at least. And the third thing that really, uh, you know, got me really interested in this book was its, approach to, uh, to some of the thinkers who are not really focused all the time when we talk about Indian political thought, Lala Hardayal, for instance, or even Tilak, the chapter on sedition law that she has beautifully written. These are, chapters in Indian political thought. These are uh, aspects of Indian political thought that are not really highlighted. So I'm really eager to listen to Shruti speaking about these overarching sort of thoughts that she explores with a lot of painstaking, meticulous studies on these particular thinkers throughout the book, Violent Fraternity. So, Shruti, I would love to listen to you speak on these salient features of your book, how you, for instance, think of juxtaposing the word violent and fraternity, not in the usual way we think of these two terms together. Uh, and you talk about intimate enmity, not in the way Nandi elaborates it, but taking it in a different direction altogether. And how you focus not on equality. I have been reading books like Aishwari Kumar's Radical Equality, which focuses on Gandhi and Ambedkar's ideas on equality and the risk of democracy, as Kumar puts it. Uh, And I have been reading another friend's wonderful book, Unconditional Equality, which you also cite in your book, by Ajay Skaria. And all those books are wonderful books, but they focus on not just Gandhi as a philosopher, something that you point out right at the beginning of your book, but also focus on equality, not essentially on, not in a very, not in a very foregrounded manner. They don't focus on the question of fraternity. I think the focus on fraternity is particularly interesting and extremely important, especially if we look around ourselves and think of our present political predicament and situations, right? So, Shruti, over to you. I have been asked by Professor Prakash to let you speak for half an hour, and then I'll be starting to interrupt you, sadly. But that's how we will go about it, and then we will open this session for question and answer from the members in our audience.
No, thank you very much for that two very generous and very faithful introductions. First, also my thanks to Professor Puriaksh for the invitation, and indeed it's wonderful to be in conversation with Kalyan Kumar Das, Professor Das. It's quite nice for me because I have actually never spoken in Calcutta. I've spoken pretty much everywhere. So this is for me quite. It's very wonderful to actually to have a large number.
Some of my students had invited you to speak about the same book, Violent Fatality. Some of my students from Presence.
Oh yes, younger students. I meant yes, last year that was lovely. In the middle of. But this is my first real seminar, really.
Right, of course.
So it feels very special, and so though I have a lot of Bengali interlocutors and students even, but it's nice to be here, and so thank you very much again. So let me first directly address some of the three things you've raised, Kalyan, very helpfully, and then I will say a little bit about my book the way I think it is. I mean, it's interesting that you mention Bailey's Recovering Liberties, in the sense that it turns to the Indian side of debates around liberalism, as opposed to, say, the Mills and Macaulays, and how they may have come to think about liberalism. So in some senses, the maneuver is to that extent similar, but it is dissimilar in the sense that my book is not recovering, as it were, to use that word, or putting together a history of a political ideology. My argument is that actually India defies an ideological coherence or fidelity at this point, which is not to say it doesn't have some dominant themes, which I will come to, and that actually the Indian age, or India's transformation from servitude to sovereignty, lies precisely in actually rejecting liberalism. The first task that actually men like Tilak set upon themselves is actually to tear down the copybook of liberalism and produce a new political vocabulary. So yes, in that sense, yes, very much. The second is a methodological difference that I have, though of course Bailey was very encouraging of the study of Indian political thought, is that really that Bailey's own work, whether it is earlier works on origins of nationality or empire and information, but also this third book, Recovering Liberties. These three books are very similar in their orientation in his writings. They are very explicitly meant to produce an intermediate history of connections between intellectual history and social history. It's explicitly stated in both the prefaces of it. Now I am, lucky in the sense that I also have been, this project has come up. I mean, I wrote most of this book, pretty much all of the book during my time at Cambridge. And I'm more in a way persuaded by, as it were, the autonomy of political ideas, that actually political ideas don't really necessarily need, I mean, people are free to do it, as people do normally, to put together social history or political economy with ideas. But I am much more, not so indebted, but persuaded by, say, the Cambridge Political Thought School, which is, say, Quentin Skinner, John Donne. They have their own differences, Annabel Brett. But to say that actually, political ideas are objects of inquiry, historical inquiry themselves, and that they're products of history itself. I go a bit further to say that actually political ideas are causes, they have causative value, and they can transform the world. So those are kind of minor differences, minor or major differences. But the book was both a kind of departure from the Bailey oeuvre, but also like it wouldn't have been possible had he not put all of this work together as well. So it's a bit of both. But I see myself much more methodologically in dialogue with Cambridge political thought, as it were. So that's one. The second thing is psychoanalytic. I mean, I tried very hard to not be very overt about, even my introduction openly says that it will, not give a methodological fix. I mean, I don't want to shut down a pretty new conversation. It's a relatively new conversation on political ideas in our part of the world, for our part of the world. So I just thought, I don't want to kind of shut that conversation down by giving a manifesto or even declaring too many of my methodological commitments out there. Of course, psychoanalysis, but particularly Freud and Lacanian psychoanalysis have had a huge bearing on my own intellectual trajectory. So I did my PhD on history of psychiatry and psychoanalysis in India. And for the last few years, I've been in training to be a psychoanalytic practitioner myself, though I'm nowhere near getting my certification yet because of the pandemic. So yes, psychoanalysis is interesting precisely because it allows for what the word I use is my methodological two words are reconstruction and interpretation. So the problem is, if you want to write a history of Indian political thought, where do you begin? It's all very well for Skinner to pick Machiavelli or Hobbes or even Locke. I mean, these are self-identified political thinkers, and they write in the systemicity of political philosophers. They are intervening in languages of that variety. And I was interested in producing, to use a fairly unfashionable word, I wanted to produce a canon of Indian political thought. I didn't just want to write about one or two figures. I also wanted to see what a thought horizon was, that this was not simply about Gandhi or not only about Ambedkar or Nehru, but how there was a kind of force field, a new political dominant vocabulary that was produced in this period, which then required me to actually use certain psychoanalytic methods which are reconstructive, which tend to be reconstructive from the material, and then go on to kind of, as it were, put it in a field of interpretation. And finally, to kind of relate to the canonical point. So I was interested, of course, Gandhi's stature as a philosopher is very much secure at the moment, has been secured partly because of the two books you mentioned, but Faisal Devji's work, Akil Bilgrami. So there's been Karuna Mantana. There's been a way in which, Gandhi has been rendered into a political philosopher by the labors of political theorists and historians who have kind of, taken away the gaze from his abilities to act to really reconstruct him again as a thinker. I think that's all very good and it's all very compelling. But as I said, I was never convinced that Gandhi was the first person to produce a critique of liberalism in India. That the very fact that he had been in dialogue with the so-called extremist world of Indian political thinking, whether it was Tilak, Aurobindo, or many others, but primarily Tilak and then latterly Savarkar, meant that there was a kind of already a given political vocabulary within which he had operated and innovated his ideas. So I actually went back, and I'll come to my book in a second, and I think that's the reason I start with Tilak and end with Patel. Patel is obviously very famous in India. He's kind of, figure with the largest, tallest statue in the country, but no one thinks of him as a thinker. He's a man of organized action. And so I was really interested in it was the most challenging chapter for me to produce, to make Tilak, produce Patel into a political thinker or philosopher. And I'll say a few moments. So the idea of fraternity as violent, as paradoxical and not normally put together is deliberate, because that is in fact the fundamental argument of the book, and which is that in India, the question of violence is turned into spaces of intimacy and fraternity into fraternal spaces as opposed to the state. So let me open some of my main arguments of the book to give a kind of live the land. So thank you, Kalyan. Very useful first questions, because they help me jump into it. I'll try not to speak for the full 30 minutes so that I can get some more thoughts from you guys. That's the more interesting thing for me. So if I speak a little less, then you can ask me questions to elaborate, because it's kind of a hard task to. So what is the book really about? As a historian, it starts with a very basic question, and I think anyone, even with a passing familiarity with Indian history, would know two landmark dates in Indian history, modern Indian history. One is 1857, and the other is 1947. And I was struck by the fact that in 1857, we all know Indians together, whether they're Hindus, Muslims, tribals, non-tribals, there's a wide social coalition, but primarily Hindus and Muslims, to use the meta two categories. More than that, Indians killed killed the British in large numbers. Sorry, someone's audio is on, so I can hear the street. Yeah, I can hear the street sound.
Yeah,
anyhow.
I'll just
mute
myself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So there was the Indians killed the British in large numbers in 1857, which is the largest anti-imperial rebellion in the 19th century, but it is also the largest amount of violence the British will see outside of the Crimean War. And it takes in the 19th century, and it takes them 2 years. It takes the British 2 years to quell the mutiny, and a huge amount of use of force. And the rest, as we know, is history, in the sense that the relationship becomes one formalized, and the rest. 90 years later, the India's freedom and decolonization is marked by extensive and deep violence, catastrophic violence, in which the only party that is spared is the British. I was interested what happened. What is the nature of political enmity that has changed in questions of antagonism and violence in this short 90-year period? And that's really the fundamental opening, as it were, conundrum that the book tries to address. And it has 2 or 3 answers. It has a kind of answer, not answers merely, but it produces, it aims to produce, as it were, saying that, well, actually, this transformation is actually key to the modern vocabulary of Indian politics, and it endures till date. So what happens? So in 1905-08, especially in Bengal, you would know that the proposed partition of Bengal triggered the Swadeshi movement. It is, as Sumit Sarkar would say, it's the first mass moment of Indian politics. And when Indians get up across in cities and small towns, bombs, and the like. But the sharp end of that the consequence of Swadeshi is really its failure. Most of the leaders are interned, or they kind of leave politics, barring one person, who is Tilak. So if you look at Aurobindo, this is when he will turn away. Indeed, even Tagore, this is the moment when Tagore will also turn to a different kind of writing in his own oeuvre. But of course, Aurobindo is the most famous renunciate of politics of this in this period. And there are several others. You can sort of see a slew of people who would kind of quit the political, the realm of the political. And barring the main leader of this period, who is Bal Gangadhar Tilak, of course known as Lokmanya, the will of the people, considered by Lenin, no less than Lenin, as the fountainhead of revolution in Asia. And so Lenin thinks that if there's going to be a revolution in Asia, it's going to come from Tilak. Lenin was half right, that yes, there was a revolution, but it was a kind of conservative revolution. And of course, Tilak goes he's charged on the most famous sedition trial in Indian history. and is then taken to Rangoon, where he produces a monumental interpretation of the Gita. And so there are two, three things with Tilak that are worth pointing out. They're not simply about the fact that, which is important, that he innovates around the public sphere using, in Hindu symbols, in Muslim contexts, and taking over. That has been very well noted. It's not about mobilization that I'm interested in. His sedition trial really gives a glimpse into what I am calling the emergence of the anti-statist political subject. That is the first argument of the book, that in India, this is why India will tear down the copybook of liberalism, because in India, the state will not become the destination of modern politics. So if you look at Skinner, if you look at all the vibrant canon of political thought and theory, they are all interested in the way in which the state becomes not just the destination of politics, but relatedly, the state is the legitimate and monopoly holder of violence. And these two things really are the sum total, in a very basic way, of a basic modern polity. You can think about rights and the rest from there on, or related to it, but I was interested in this question. And it is precisely in this question, because the Swadeshi had failed, precisely because the colonial state was so powerful, that Tilak says we have to go back and really re-look at the basic grammar of politics. And so the first thing he does is that he decouples the work of law from violence. And that is really a breach that is created through the sedition trial that you see. He also produces what I am, Apache Carl Schmitt, calling a new kind of political theology, which is not to say that there is no secularism or is there secularism, but rather to say that there's an open interplay between religion and politics, which kind of brooking no boundaries, produces, as it were, modern political conceptual vocabulary. We can go into it in detail later, but this will explain why secularism is also not a starter for us. And then the third thing that he does, which is incredibly important, is that this anti-statism is not a negative precept, but a precept which is, it's just not a negation. It's not enough to be anti-imperial or just to be anti-statist, but he endows the anti-statist subject with certain ethical precepts and makes the figure of Arjuna, the ideal from the Gita, the ideal political subject. So if you all know our Gita, the Gita is given precisely at the start of a war in which Arjuna doesn't want to kill his teachers, his preceptors, his cousins. He's like, what sort of war is this where I have to kill my own? And of course, the Krishna and the Lord will come and tell Krishna that the war will take place regardless of whether Arjuna kills. But the question that will remain is whether he remains a warrior, whether he's true to his own duty, whether he's true to his own subjectivity. And that really becomes a way in which a subject-oriented, to use a psychoanalytic term, subject-oriented horizon of the political is constructed by Tilak. And such a subject is then capable of sacrifice, but also removes the hand of the state on questions of life and death, or simply put, sovereignty. And this becomes a very, very powerful, operable precept, because Tilak's writings are on the democratic, if I may use the word, democratic and sublime possibilities of the bomb. And that's really what gets him into trouble. And, Khudiram Bose and the like, anyhow, but the point being that this story becomes planetary and global with the Gadar, and it goes into the global sphere, and then from there on, and that global sphere is actually, the secret spirit has always been Tilak, but its leader, one of the leaders, was Hardayal, whom please I recommend you to read him. He's an interesting guy because he's more like a public intellectual come sort of proto-terrorist. I don't know how to call it, but he's an insurgent. He's an interesting insurgent and important insurgent. But since we don't have too much time, but I just want to lay out the main genealogy. That actually the figure from Tilak via Gadar, the most important Tilak and the most important intervention apart from Gadar, which would be dramatic, but not especially consequential ideologically, would be Savarkar, because Savarkar comes out precisely from this moment in London and the like. And the first half of the book also shows that three really important political texts are written within a year of each other. One is, of course, Bhagavad Gita, the monumental commentary by Tilak, Hind Swaraj by Gandhi, in direct response to meeting these chaps in London, and indeed Savarkar's first English account in a history, what we call modern historiography of the Indian Mutiny is also produced, or the First War of Independence. They're all written within a year of each other, and I try and make some sense of what they're trying to do vis-a-vis Indian politics. And Savarkar, so my main concern with Savarkar is really to show this idea of how fraternity, the subject-oriented idea, is then produced into a fraternity of secrecy, and how secrecy is incredibly important. We know the RSS was, conjured as a secret society, and this is a genealogical link also with Gadar. So I'm interested in the work between secrecy and visibility there, and the work of anonymity and a kind of new kind of fraternal horizon that is produced. But with Savarkar, my main intervention is that while we are accustomed to seeing, so Savarkar is interesting, like Nehru, like many others, even R.C. Dutt, K.M. Munshi, the whole slew of Indian political thinking is written in the historical register. So Indian political ideologues tend to write history, and he's an early practitioner of it. But my view is that it is not so much as, we tend to think that this is fake history or bad history and the rest. I'm actually making the point that this Savarkar's concern with history is really a form of so-called utopia of futuristic thinking. It's really about laying down the conditions for the possibilities of how Hindutva might come to be. So in really, Hindutva to me is not a history of an identity, fake or not fake, nor is it really a history of a nationality or a theory of nationality, but it is a unique theory of violence in search of its own history. That's really what it is about. And this search is, Hindutva is also a collision with India's history for its mastery. So that's really what I show. And then I show that though we are accustomed to thinking that Ambedkar and Gandhi were the key antagonists, thanks to the book some of you mentioned, but even Arundhati Roy, but actually the key enmity in India, the key psychic and political division in India is between Savarkar and Gandhi. And then the book moves to Gandhi as a kind of apotheosis, as a kind of perfection of this anti-statist political subjectivity, but moved out of this question of violence. And here I kind of bring to bear that why all of this is anti-liberal. It's anti-liberal because it doesn't take life as the centerpiece of politics. So liberalism is interested in the protection and enhancement and the flourishing of life, whereas Gandhi would embrace death, and death would be the only category for him, which is beyond exchange, and therefore the most important political, not just tool, but premise of politics would be sacrifice and the question of death. So he kind of summates these politics, earlier politics, and redirects them. I mean, in some ways, in a shorthand way, he's an anarchist, but his politics is much more than that, because it is also, has issues around caste and religion, which I will be very happy to discuss because they're elaborated at length in the book, his differences with Ambedkar on the one side, but also the very controversial question about Hindu conversions into Muslims in the Mapela riots and what happens at that point, and Gandhi's politics, bit of how Hindus and Muslims may live. But So then really the second half, this is really the first half of the book, or more than first half of the book. And this project is notably critiqued. This anti-statist political idea, the idea of the political, what is the political, is not just, okay, it is in India, the answer is that it is rested in intimacy and violence, and that the meaning and that the only enemy to be discovered thanks to the Gita, but also other ways of thinking, is not the external, not the foreigner, as it is in the West. So in the West, it's the refugee, it's the immigrant, it's the foreigner who occupies the position of the political enemy. And in India, really by this point, it is very clear that the only political enemy or antagonism capable of hostility is the one which is known, intimate, familiar, in short, one's brother or neighbor. And that Gandhi has also kind of completely understood it and therefore wants to reformulate politics like that. Now, Ambedkar says all of this is all completely true in some ways. He has no issue with understanding any of this. And he is saying, well, okay, I fully agree with you that the spaces of intimacy in India are entirely internal. But the question of violence is located not simply in the subject horizon. It's not just my ability to kill or your ability to die, which is what Gandhi has said, that, well, the state cannot be an abstract holder of violence or of sovereign power. You and I are the people who kill or die. So these are our individual capacities or individual human capacities. And Ambedkar is like, okay, great, but there's a kind of problem with this, because this is rooted in a highly invisible form of violence. It is so violent that it doesn't even require for it to be visible, which is caste. That caste is actually a sovereign order. It is not it's not about equality. It is not really about occupation. It is not even about society, because that what it has is a sovereign order written into it, and which are relations of violence. And so they're all interested in questions of sovereignty and fraternity. So he's saying, well, India's antisocial order, it militates against forming not just a fraternity, but also a democracy, which is ultimately what he's interested in. So unlike other receptions of Ambedkar, I see him as a classic thinker of radical sovereignty and radical democracy. I see him less as a theorist of justice or even a theorist of equality. And his argument then would be, I have 5 minutes, I will just fold up here. His argument is that how India needs to become, he says there's a big problem. He says, well, if unlike, say, he's very aware of the French tradition and he's very critical of the Marxist tradition. And he's saying, well, unlike the French, if you kill off the king, there will be no equality of people, or no people, which is the basic bedrock of democracy, will emerge. Because India, according to the word I use, it does not have a regicide it's not possible to have a regicide, because really the formation of the king in India is in the immortality of the sovereign Brahmin. So Brahmin is a kind of dispersed monarchy running through the Indian social fabric. And therefore, as a result, you're never going to get a republic, because this is an immortal sovereign sitting in India, which militates both against the formation of fraternity, society, but also modern statecraft. And so he would then have a solution to it, which would be, of course, one way would be reservations that we know, but the other would be also, and he's making the argument also in Pakistan, that the contemporary violence between Hindus and Muslims is entirely superficial, he says. It's important, but it's superficial, it's not deep. And that's because of its kind of competition over rulership. So he has some solutions on this idea of producing, as it were, a republican democracy in India and a republican recognition of a republic in Pakistan on the other. I then have a chapter on Baal, because I do think republicanism then becomes the ascendant political vocabulary from anti-statism to popular sovereignty. And Iqbal is really, for me, the crucial thinker of modern political Islam, who rediscovers the true nature of political Islam in its Republican order. So I welcome you to read him, read that chapter. I really enjoyed writing it because it was like really being immersed in a completely different universe for me. And for me, the interesting thing about Iqbal here was that I have revised and critiqued pretty much all available understandings of Iqbal, because they tend to think of him as a global thinker who has transcended, territory and the like. The book finally ends with partition and Patel, and here there's one simple, hopefully powerful point, that it's really in the violence of that era that the era of the people emerges. The category of the people truly emerges in a civil war. So partition violence to me is not, so I'm revising the story of partition violence is simply instrumental bargain, who got which district and the like. We have seen enough of that. Or simply as some kind of violence which happened to people, as if history extracted a personal price out of them. So it's a kind of guilt-free violence. Everyone's a victim in this violence. And I'm like, this is really not possible. It's a civil war. These people, And so I'm revising it as essentially very profoundly political violence, a form of political violence. And the aim really is then to look at Patel's speeches in that era, in the way in which that catastrophic violence is absorbed for the foundation of the Republic. And that then I also conclude with how Gandhi's assassination acts as an amnesty on this civil war, but it also becomes known at this point that the Indian psychic division and political division now will be again once more internal, i.e. between Hindutva and Gandhi. And then there's an epilogue looking at all these 3 or 4 elements in contemporary India, and that's the book.
Thank you, Shruti, for that wonderful summing up of your book. Listening to you, I was also thinking of how you explore, because I have read that part of your book very carefully with a lot of interest and attention. I was thinking of that part of your book where you are exploring how Ambedkar, and you actually offer something that hasn't been done elaborately in the available literature on Ambedkar as a political thinker, barring the tiny section that is dedicated to this particular book by Ambedkar in Partha Chatterjee's Politics of the Governed. I'm talking about Ambedkar's Pakistan, or the Partition of India, Thoughts on Pakistan. And you actually give us a wonderful reading of that book, and how Ambedkar looks at the construction or the possibility of the construction of the independent state of Pakistan, and the larger question of partitioning the South Asian subcontinent. If we could just throw some light on that with respect to what the major points that you have already outlined, because that in my consideration, I think that's a very original kind of intervention that you are making there, and the audience will only get benefited if you briefly speak on that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Ambedkar, first and foremost, I think it is in itself astounding that he is the only political ideologue, thinker, actor in this period who writes a substantial treatise on Pakistan. So you don't really have very many books on Pakistan. So you have, of course, Iqbal's oeuvre, but it's not necessarily organized under the sign of Pakistan. You have some pamphlets. You have a great many, incendiary prose, vernacular or in English. But there is no kind of philosophical treatment of this problem. And so my first question was, wow. So when I was beginning to write this book, I ordered, because I didn't have any leave, I bought books, so I bought collected works, and I, Ambedkar's was one of the first. I knew I was going to write on him, and I'd been reading odds and ends, and I saw like the kind of, and I was like, okay, this is not a small book. It's several hundred pages for a start, and I was a bit stunned that there's been so much historiography in Pakistan that no one had really read this or had understood it. And so I was interested in, what was in it for him. Why was he interested in this? After all, he's arguing with Gandhi on the idea of the minority, on the idea of the Dalit and the like. And so I thought I was prepared to read some of that kind of thinking, majority, minority, the usual kind of, not usual, but the kind of imperial legal language around it, And there is a bit of that. But, when you read all of Ambedkar together, and, unlike Gandhi and unlike Nehru, though there's been good effort, he's not really served by a good editor. There's a lot of repetition in his, writings, and that tells you how badly he has been treated by the Indian state, because, his works are just languishing without proper annotation. So anyhow, long story short, I was struck by the fact that actually throughout his work, he really is not that animated by justice, which is what people tend to think of him as. Yes. He's really animated by violence and sovereignty and revolutionary ideas, but not Marxist, mostly French, like French revolutionary thinking, but also then Buddhist and ancient Indian thinking around revolution and counter-revolution. And he's really interested in what is caste. If you recall, in 1916, he is one of the first Indians to write about caste in that kind of new manner, which is not Orientalist and the like. And there's a kind of abiding thread in Ambedkar's writing, which is an interest in the idea of separation, because caste for him is a series of separations. So, and of course, Pakistan is demanding a separation. The idea of Pakistan is demanding a separation. So he's, I think, juxtaposing those two forms of separation, which I bring together in my chapter. So he wants the end of separation, violent separation of castes, so that India can be a republic. So his argument contra Gandhi is that you're not going to be able to change people's behavior. You can try, though, subject-oriented is great. What you really need is not simply the annihilation of caste, but you need, as it were, the conversion of this civil war written into India, which is playing out. It has to end. It has to become a non-violent, converting, the word I use is converting antagonists into adversaries, or converting enemies into competitors. And that's really what reservations to me would become, is that you have the facing of different caste groups in a kind of agonistic struggle, to use the word, to a struggle for mastery and the like. So that's kind of calling for an end of separation. Whereas Pakistan for him, and this is, his argument is that this is because the violence of sovereign, this is how the sovereign crucible of Indian caste order has to be destroyed if you want to be a democracy. So it's not simply about justice, it's about, as I said, the immortality of the Brahmin that needs to go. The problem with Muslims and Hindus, according to him, is one that the violence is not deep, but it is superficial. It is not systemic, but it is symbolic. So it is precisely because it's symbolic. My hero is your anti-hero is my hero. It has this kind of visceral, ambient quality. And it's very mobilized, he says, in this period. It's mobilized because, this is a competition over rulership. And that's how he comes up with this idea of Pakistan. But he also is interested, in my argument, I show that he's also looking at theories of natural rights, that how do people live together? How is violence managed in societies and how it becomes undone? And he uses those critical theories also to argue that actually what has happened to the Muslim political consciousness is that it's no longer thinking of itself as a community. It is thinking of itself as a political unit and as a nation. And that recognition for him is important. That kind of separation, secession is important. And therefore, he would put these two, the caste story, as constitutive of the story of Pakistan, or the Pakistan story being constitutive of India's republican order. You can't have one without the other. And my view is that he prevails over Gandhi, ultimately. Though he lost the Pune Pact, Gandhi's victory in his lifetime was Pyrrhic, but Ambedkar prevails in a way, to a manner of speaking, in the way in which the republican architecture of India is instituted.
Right.
Does that make sense? Or
yeah, of course, absolutely. I'm absolutely enjoying reading your book. I'm yet to finish some sections of the book, I must admit, but I'm absolutely. I've completed three-fourths of the book, but yeah,
yes.
I'll just. I hope to finish it in a week or so.
And that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's time for us to open this session for the members in the audience to put forward their questions. And I think Professor Maria Franke has also joined us. So
yeah.
I was wondering if Professor Murshid Alam and Professor Maria Franke and others, including Professor Prakash, certainly, if they have got their questions or interventions, comments to make, that would be lovely. And if they don't, then I'll eat up the entire time. I'll have many more things to talk about.
So there's a question in the Q&A.
Yeah. I just click on it. Okay. Dhritiman, one of my former students, Dhritiman is asking this question: from anti-statist to what is now referred to as the enchantment of the state. The question that kind of recurs is, what does this intellectual history offer to our contemporary, where enmity is not ideational, but lived in, practiced with impunity? So is the presence of the state penetrating almost all the conceivable spheres of life. How to use this repertoire of political thinking you discussed to then not consciously cede all the spaces of politics to the statist paradigm, as is generally the case with the political scientists in India? That's the question that Dhritiman has asked.
Well, thank you. It's a very good question, and it's an obvious one too, if I may say so, in that sense that what is the genealogy of this world? Obvious in a good way, because my book is written in the contemporary 8-10 years. So I'm not kind of devoid or free of the contemporary context. So my point is not that this is an ideational enmity. These people are reflecting on the lived enmity of that period between Hindus and Muslims, between caste groups and the like. So I don't think that this period is any less violent or otherwise. So there are, as the epilogue makes it clear, in India, the state does not become the naturalized political, monopoly holder of violence, and a range of anti-statist political mobilizations, from violent to non-violent ones, have existed in its life. From environmentalism, which is a non-violent one, to say Maoism today, and to say nothing of lynch mobs and the like, which are also kind of organized in the fraternal spaces of society rather than the capacities of the state. Having said that, the state is indeed an incredibly powerful body, but I'm interested not in the state as this, that story is universal for America, because if you've seen what happened in the Trump era. So if I can telegraphically put it, there is, quite a good important book come out in political theory by Richard Tuck called The Sleeping Sovereign, which looks at Hobbes under Brexit, because everyone thought sovereignty had kind of died, when you have this kind of world of globalization and the like, and he makes very crucial distinction between government and sovereignty. And that's one way of approaching the story of the state, because the state is too abstract a category. You can have actors of the state, but for me, even if I don't even get into this literature, I think one of the contradictions of India's politics, and particularly democracy, which is what I'm interested in, is, and to go back to Kalyan's opening point, that there's an absolute contradiction between liberty and sovereignty in India. So, so Indians fought for freedom, but what they got was sovereignty. These are two very different things. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other way to think about it is, which can be more, let me put it like that, a bit more, not just concrete, but why is it that Patel, why is it that Savarkar, why is it that Gandhi, why is it that Subhash Bose, why are they in our midst at this point? Yeah. Why do they have this kind of foundation? Why are they animating the political sphere in Indian politics? Why are they animating this? So I'm interested in also their father figurations, if I may use it, and that these ideas have been so foundational that they are not done with. They're not ossified. We are in that world still and playing them out. So all I say is, I welcome you I invite you to read the book, but the point being that this search of democracy is not the same as the state. So what is happening in India is a massive contestation between government and democracy, or democracy and the state, or sovereignty and liberty. And that's all I can say at this point. And this is partly why you can see why the Constitution has been so easily messed around with. So.
I think Professor Purkasa has forwarded a question there in the chat box. He begins by thanking you for this wonderful talk, but then there is this question: could you please elaborate on how Indian political thinking went beyond the state and adopted the individual political subject? Because that's something that you persistently talk about throughout the book. Even that is a question that I would love to focus on. Furthermore, please also expand a bit more on the role of secrecy and martyrdom, which you mentioned in your book. How do you connect these two categories with contemporary Indian politics?
Okay, so let me start with the second one first. Thank you very much. And I would say on martyrdom and sacrifice, how about the farmers' protest? The farmers' protest has been a quintessential. I know I got into some trouble on Facebook over it, but it's a quintessential Gandhian struggle. You don't need to, unlike Aam Aadmi Party, put posters of Gandhi and then do nothing with it. This is a totally Gandhian struggle at one level, but also it channeled very important ideas of sacrifice within Sikhism that were available to the world. So I think these are very potent political ideas in India that cannot just be done with. On secrecy, I think the story is the RSS. And I write about the potency of secrecy for the RSS, and how, because we have now some substantial writings now on the RSS, but very little is understood by this idea of secrecy. Why were they secretive? Why do they have to have an oath? Why was their constitution not public? And if you look at Nandi, or if you look at other people, it's always seemed to be a conspiratorial or a crypto nationalism. I'm actually saying no. Secrecy is of the essence, and what it does is it allows. I use George Simmel's work, the theorist, the sociological theorist of secrecy in the early 20th century, to sort of to unpack that when ideas are either not in fruition. So he has an argument about secret societies. Why do they exist? Why are they always there? Freud went to one, So either when things are new and they're not fully actualized. Secret societies work, as he says, as a transit stadium between their appearance and actualization. And they're really important as a kind of contextual element. But I was more interested in the other side, that the secret society also allows a remaking of a person or a group in relation, but in opposition to what is considered to be the dominant or the manifest world. And RSS really fashioned a second order of subjectivity contra Gandhi and contra Congress nationalism. And thirdly, it produced a very highly structured and anonymous language of obedience and submission, of which we all know of. So I do something with, but in the book, I show that the kernel of this idea, the origins of this idea, lies in the radical anti-imperial insurgent societies of the Gadar movement. This is really, or even Hedgewar uses Ram Prasad Bismil's, left-leaning constitution to forge the constitution and structure of, Okay, so that's secrecy, and martyrdom is therefore attached to it, and sacrifice is attached to it. On the subject, the question is really very simple. It's not that it starts with, as I said, the break up of the looking at the West also looks at the individual subject, the liberal subject, as the kind of rights-bearing subject, right? This is the big revolution in the 19th century, that you and I have rights, and and if I go like very basic, 101 idea of politics. What is the basic idea of modern politics is that you and I give up a little bit of our freedom to the so-called state in a system of contractual obligations, and in return, the state will protect my life. Yeah, this is sovereignty. This is 101 politics in the modern era. And it's really this that someone like Tilak disrupts by saying that actually life cannot be contracted out, or death cannot be contracted out to the state. These are questions of, these are individual human capacities. The state may be able to kill in an institutionalized form, but this is where, he writes about the bomb as a kind of equalizing force between the sovereign and the subject. And that's all I can say at this point, and that this is how Gandhi will also develop it. And this basic unit will be deployed differently by Savarkar, Gandhi, Gadar, and Tilak. But this is the metrics that will then be redirected towards the popular sovereignty, towards democracy, towards a different way of thinking about violence by someone like, this will be steered towards Republican shores by primarily Ambedkar, but also Patel, and in a different register by Iqbal.
Okay, I think in the chat box there is another question. From Shruti Roy Chaudhary, how the Indian age redefined the concept of fraternity, and in what ways it is different from the Western concept of fraternity.
Well, thank you. I love this question because, I'm very, this book was started it about 10 years ago in 2012, 2013. And there were other debates I was interested in because I was interested in psychoanalysis. I'm sorry for this kind of slightly personalized detour, but I just thought I could, explain where this might come from and why I have picked the forms of interlocution I have picked in my book. And so one was that I was dissatisfied by the idea that I knew that liberalism, in my bones, I knew liberalism was not a living philosophy in India. I knew India was not a rule of law society, simply put, and so I was just interested. Then why? Okay, this is great. It was really important as a form of critique of empire, but it doesn't really have much to do with Indian politics. Certainly not in the 20th century. yes, there is the constitution, but the constitution is also like, I have always been skeptical of its kind of pervasive powers that are given to it. But so I was interested. So I had these two questions, and I had this kind of very enlightening experience, if I can use that word advisedly. So there was this very famous conference in Birkbeck College in London. I think it was 2008 or 9, or it could be later. And when Savoy Zizek, Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, Kopchak, Jean Kopchak, they basically, and it's become now a famous volume of what is communism. And the debate really was like, okay, it was post financial crisis, what is going on? Who are we? And I was really, at that time, I was interested in that. They're all very psychoanalytically minded people. And I was already in that world thinking about these things. And Badiou wrote a very compelling set of books, not just on the subject, but also really saying that in the 20th century, the key manifestation of politics is how to live with others, or the question of fraternity. And it suddenly was like, yes, a bingo, I agree with you. That, actually by the 20th century, liberty is out of the window. Justice, even equality may have been around, but it seems a bit kind of forced, if I can use that word. The key question across the world is how to live with each other while killing and not killing each other. And so for me, the fraternity in that sense was a correct focus on, if I wanted to see what counted, because at that point I was interested in what counted as the political in India. Not everything is politics, right? How do you, what counts for the political? And so it's very different from the Western experience, because it is not a contractual language. It is not a language of social contract that emerges. And that's where I'd leave it. And so the Indian age is therefore refers, as I say, not to one figure or even to one ideology, but to a horizon of thinking. And it's a historical epoch. It's not, so it's also trying to kind of counter the idea of India, or the Indian ideology, the way in which we think in terms of civilizational grandeur and the like. So,
okay, we have got 3 more
Kalyan.
questions. Yeah, Murshid.
Yeah. Can I put my questions?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kapila, for your wonderful talk. I have 2 questions. One is, where do you place the Indian Marxist thinkers, such as Muzaffar Ahmed or M.N. Roy, some of whom operated on the global level? Okay, and you mentioned about the moment as the political reorientation in India, as the post-Swadeshi movement. And in this post-Swadeshi movement, there is this emergence of the Indian Marxism, you can say, or these actors who operated. So where do you place Indian Marxist thinkers in your schema of Indian political ideas? Second question, can you really escape the state? Because 2 years back, the state came heavily on we can say the Muslims in India with the Citizenship Amendment Act, and the protest also was directed to the constitution, to the state. So how do you think of these political actions happening right in the contemporary India? Thank you.
No, thank you, Professor Alam, for this 2 quite difficult questions, because they both are forcing me to out myself from things I've deliberately left out. And so you're like really pushing me. I get it. So let me just say that on Marxism, I was really interested. Not very many people know that one of the persons in contention to represent India in the Comintern was a man named Barkatullah Bhopali. And Barkatullah is a character I write about, who is part of the Gadar movement. And I look at how these people who are actually radical insurrectionists prior even to the Russian Revolution, I'm interested in how and why they don't join up communism. And that's a really interesting story to be told. It's not my story I wish to tell. But there is something going on with this kind of international movement, which is in three different vectors of pan-Islamism, of Bolshevism, and then anti-imperial insurgency. And here the Indians really are trailblazers. They are total trailblazers in the story, whether it's Hardayal, whether it is Pandurang Khan Goje, or indeed Barkatullah, on whom the three figures I focus on. So Marxism, in a way, the only time I deal with it is how, in a way, Barkatullah kind of is not there, how these guys don't get there. But let's put it like this, that I was looking at the genealogy of Indian democracy and Indian republicanism. And while communism and Marxism have been very important forces, with all due respect, and I just found it, these other guys were more, let's put it like that, not just consequential, but more innovative. So I looked at what was of the highest consequence. The book is not a total history. It's a pointillistic history of this period. And the pointillism is on what is of consequence, what becomes consequential. And which is not to say Marxism is not consequential, but it is not to the degree in which, say, Ambedkar is consequential. So that would be that for now. I mean, though it's not far from exhausted. So I'm not saying the state is written away, far from it. After all, the state is what, my argument is that what we may call the political lies beyond the state. The state is not the same as the political. And of course, the state will aim to take over control and the like. And precisely because men like Ambedkar and Patel knew that the origins of the political, the potency of the political, or the power of the political lies beyond the state, this is precisely why Indian Constitution will enshrine a host of emergency measures inside it. So the sedition debate, we might think sedition is a statute which the founding fathers were lazy to get rid of. Far from it, it was debated and it was decided to keep it. And so my argument is not anti-statism wins out. I'm just saying that the political is beyond the state, and the state will be interested in regulating, much like the colonial state was, regulating the realm of the political.
Okay, we have three more questions, and I don't think we'll have enough time to take any more questions. So I would restrict this program to these last three questions, and then we'll have to wrap up. So Nazima has put forward a good question. She says she thanks you for your talk, and then asks, she's wondering if there is any way you think we can rethink your notion of martyrdom vis-a-vis the figure of disposable and almost ungrievable, unmournable, and definitely invisibilized Muslim lives who are always already marginalized and rendered into quote-unquote bare lives, perhaps in an Agamemnian sense, in contemporary India, and the possibility of a radical Muslim democratic subject and a thriving Muslim polity, particularly under the current political dispensation, which has otherwise made Muslim votes somehow electorally irrelevant.
Yeah, so I love this question, and I love the question, the substance of it. I'll tell you. So since we are having such a nice chat, and I've been so, I don't know, maybe I was so thrilled to be in conversation with these really well-read Bengali students and faculty, that I feel very open to discussing my likes and dislikes, So in terms of, so my first part of your question has a kind of hint of Agamben and of the bare life and of disposability and even say Mbembe, as post-colonial sovereignty. And so I am, my book is definitely not interested, but is not doing that because it is interested in because the bare life point, as Mbembe makes, or then even Agamben makes, is that it's limitless. Then you can't kind of think about it in a kind of contained manner for any society either, and therefore the ultimate symbol for that would be the refugee, the camp, and the like. Now that's great, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how is it that India produces this kind of democracy and the like. So if you ask different questions, you have to look at different interlocutors. So on the question of the Muslim subject, okay, so this really truly interests me because I was interested in not just looking at how Ambedkar thought of Pakistan, but I was interested in what Iqbal thought of it. But the problem has been that within both in Indian studies of India's democracy, but also more generally, that the Pakistan question seems to exhaust the Muslim question in India. And that's partly why separate electorates are denied at that point, or special reservations are denied in 50, because precisely because, like Patel is saying, well, it's exhausted. This question is exhausted. And I was not satisfied by that claim. I was wanting to look at, so I look in my chapter on Patel on how actually the Muslim subject is so fragmented in this period. Fragmented between not just the India-Pakistan story of the kind of loyalty-disloyalty problem, the way the communal discourse would emerge in this period. But it is so fragmented to be gathered up into the project of unitary sovereignty. But I make if you can bear with me, I make a slightly different point around the foreign and enemy story, which then becomes the story of enmity. So one of the ways to psychoanalytically think, Freud writes about it, that, we have a kind of intimacy of our, as it were, of our brother. We know who our brothers are. This is the problem, not just siblings. And the neighbor as a category has always been not just ethically important, but it is shrouded in an unknowability. That it is the one thing that, there's a kind of, not secrecy, but an unknowability attached to it. Now, the problem with the partition story is that it makes the familiar unfamiliar. It makes the intimate external. That's the work of civil war. But what it does is it swaps the necessary features of the neighbor with the brother, which is to say, our neighbor is entirely transparent to us. Their intentions, we think we know the Pakistan. Neighbor is someone transparent in their intentions. And at the same time, the brother at home, the minority, the Muslim minority, becomes unknowable and esoteric, if I can use that word. And I think, I'm sorry to give you such a theoretical answer, but I think there is something going on here with Muslim politics, both in terms of its visibility, invisibility, but also in its ability to both be at the center of fulfilling the Indian nation, but also then being so depleted to be gathered up into a proper political subject. That's all I can say. Which is not to say that this is not marginalized. Of course, the violence against Muslims and all of that I write about, but I'm trying and understand what is going on, what happens. And I think the Pakistan story is when you make brothers into foreigners or make brothers into enemies, then what you have is that the brother in your midst, i.e. the Muslim minority, is the one that becomes enigmatic and esoteric.
Okay. There is another question from Shilpashri Mishra. She says, as a scholar of post-colonial masculinities, I'm currently looking at how British colonialism affected the performance of masculinity in India. Shikata Banerjee, in her book Make Me a Man, refers to muscular Hindu masculinity a la Anandamath as the warrior monk and Hindu soldier. What are your thoughts on the performance of masculinity in relation to Hindu nationalism today?
I think it's clear as daylight. It doesn't require me to say very much, you know. So you have said it, but from, you know, what can I say? You know, whether it's colonial, I don't know, but the RSS world is not simply about colonial masculinity. It's about, as I said, a particular orientation towards secrecy, towards anonymity, towards aggregation, towards obedience, and militarization is a part of it, but it's yeah, I mean, it's channeling all those things that you rightly point out.
Okay. Then I guess this would be the last question. There is another question from Devarati Dotto, but we would have to apologize to her. I think we are running out of time. But if we have some time left, we will certainly include her question. But for the time being, let's address Shubhendra Bhaumik's question. The question is, I assume you somewhat hinted at some problematic relationship between republicanism and democracy. While the idea of a republic has to give some room, even if grudgingly, to an idea of a sovereign state, democracy may question at the root of uh, every conceivable question, even challenging the state itself. Do you see the idea of the people can somehow breach the problematic relationship? But how, particularly in a country fraught with the trouble of fraternal violence from mythical times, with all its attendant problems? I think this is something that you already explore in your book, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But thank you so much. And I just say thank you because it just means that we are on the same page,
Yeah,
because it's exactly what the final two chapters are really about,
exactly.
how we go from fraternity to the people, precisely to surmount this problem of fraternal violence. And why
I think
actually,
you also talk about fratricidal fraternity, right?
yes, that's right, and that it's fratricidal, and it's written into it. And thank you, that's very helpful, Kalyan. I've forgotten some of my own stuff, but yeah, but you
It's
know,
all the time, yeah.
so but yeah, so it's yeah. So I would say that's precisely the vision behind the Constitution, but also what is going on then is very much in the spirit of your question. And yet what would happen would be that the civil war would show the people as not simply an idea of hope, but also full of danger. And the idea is full of danger and also pregnant with violence. So yeah, that's a good question in terms of it follows from what I've been saying entirely.
Okay, so we actually have some time left to
Yes.
discuss Devarati's question. How do you see the changing ideational history of modern India vis-a-vis the rise of mass politics contributing to the idea of the people? And how can we think of it beyond the category? So it's kind of
So I think I think I
related
think it's really, yeah. I mean, so the thing is, when I first thought of this book, I thought I would take it all the way to 1984, and I have an interest in Sikh militancy, and say, well, maybe 84 really was the death of the post-colonial state in India, and we go somewhere else after that, and I did write up a couple of chapters, particularly around the 60s, going back to the Marxism question. Why is it that the social question or communism became the first opposition to the Congress? But then I kind of gave up, not because it would be like really exhaustive book to write, but I gave up for a different reason, that I actually think that the history of democracy is related to this period. These are the foundational building blocks, but it is also its own separate history. So I will resist the temptation of folding the history of Indian democracy, say the way Jaffalo does, or some others also do. Like they fold it all together in one thing. So it's very trendy to say we must move histories beyond 1947. Yes, of course, we should write beyond 1947, but 1950 is a distinct historical epoch, which has, of course, links to this period, but I don't want to write a seamless continuity of that history. So that would be my way to say that Indian democracy's foundations are laid down in this period, 100%, vocabulary, architecture, and the like. But the story of India's democracy will, produce its own vocabulary, produce its own issues, which requires a separate treatment. Though my epilogue does hint at some of the ways. So, let me just give a more kind of like a basic example. Like, why is it that we are interested in Patel today? Why is it that certain figures come up? They tell us how new fraternal horizons are being remade in our period. Yeah. So these things are not simply cynical, but they're also reflective of certain shifts in fraternal politics in India.
Okay, Shruti, we have the last question of the
day. Oh gosh, yes, another one, yes.
Yeah, there is another one. So Purnajit Haldar is asking this question.
Sedition.
He says, but I would like to ask you to talk about the relevance of sedition attached to every spontaneous outburst happening in what we know as democracy in India. So would you like to quickly respond to that,
I think,
and then we'll wrap?
Yeah, thank you. My book begins with Tilak's sedition, and my epilogue begins with asking what are we doing with it still 100 years later? Yeah. And so I'm not in that camp of thinkers who thinks, oh gosh, this is a stupid old colonial law, which, is just a hangover, it's just a colonial hangover. No, sedition is pretty serious business, and it's related to ideas of sovereignty. And therefore today, I show that sedition is a category of sovereignty, and why the question of law and violence is there. But sedition is also the supreme legal instrument, anywhere, treason, which brings intense legibility to the nature of enmity. And therefore, its repeated deployment today is about the violent redefinition of what the national is. That's it.
Yeah, I think you see it more in terms of this tension between what you call anti-statist formation of the anti-statist political subject.
Yeah, so the origins are there. The origins are there. The origins are there.
And the state-centric idea of sovereignty. Yeah.
Yeah. So you obviously have this idea of where the sovereign power might lie, and that's a tussle. And this is precisely why, as you rightly point out, that this is why the lawmakers will keep sedition on the statute,
right?
Because they realize that this anti-statist stuff is so powerful. We brought down the IT empire down to it, right? Yeah, so that's the rationale why it is. But what is sedition in relation to the political? Sedition is the arch vocabulary of antagonism, legal antagonism. But it is also related to sovereignty. So when it is deployed today, it is not talking simply about loyalty. It is talking about the redefinition of what the national is. So I would welcome your thoughts on engagement on the book, and it is available for all of 800 rupees in Penguin India. So please, not that you have to buy it, but it's not just a Princeton book; it's also got a South Asia edition.
Yeah. I guess I have the South Asian edition with me.
No, they look the same. They look the same. We didn't change anything. We didn't change anything. It's absolutely the same.
Yeah,
it's distributed by Penguin. It's just the pricing. It's
okay, right. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Shruti, for this wonderful talk as well as discussions that we have got today. I would like to now hand over this session to Professor Purkayastha to formally, bring this to an end, not really a kind of closure. So let it be a kind of ongoing discussion and debate. And I hope to get back to Shruti with some more inputs on how I have been enjoying.
I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kalyan.
Thank you. Thank you, Shruti, for this wonderful session, for all the talk and the question and answer session. And thank you, Kollan, also for this excellent moderation of the session. And I'm sure that this conversation will continue and we will have occasions to learn further from your work. We have learned so much from
No,
your
no.
previous works on intellectual history, and we continue to learn because this is a subject which is, which concerns everyone with the kind of
Yes.
thing which is happening around India right now. So we will get back to your work more and more.
Thank you
And
so much.
yeah, thank you so much. And I thank Maria and my colleague Murshid Alam and all the other members of the PSAGS and all the other participants. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. A
Thank you
total
so much.
pleasure. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you,
Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Kalyan. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Dr.
Bye
Prashant.
bye. So we're
Bye.
closing it today. We'll have the day 2 event tomorrow, and I'll
Yeah.
send the link and other details very
Thank you.
soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.